Geographers, welcome to the home stretch. We've got these 5 countries to go, and then we're off to Australia. So we'll start with China, and China is our most populous nation on Earth. It's got a lot of diversity within it. It's a huge political power in the world right now. We've got the superpowers of the United States and China. So we'll break it down. First, a little bit of physical geography. You'll notice in the lecture guide for China, or for East Asia, I've got a little drawing and I call it the China bean. That's to help you kind of break the regions down for their different cultural differences and also some of their physical geography differences. And so it's a simplified model of China is what it is. So this is kind of complicated to draw in your notes. This is a little bit easier. So just in your notes on the side, draw a bean shape and just put the lines in it, and we'll fill in information about it as we go. So that first line, that vertical line, that's that splitting between the dry western portion of Tibet and Xinjiang in China from the more humid regions to the east. And it's a factor of rain shadows from the Taklamakan, the Himalayas, and the Tian Shan mountain ranges. The eastern part, this is where the bulk of the population lives, sometimes called China proper. The more humidity allows for obviously more agricultural productivity and can support the large populations. The dominant food product in that area is rice. Rice has a high calorie output per acre, and there's other advantages to growing rice that I've mentioned. And this is one of the primary factors in supporting the large populations. And I think I was redundant, but we're just going to let that one go for now. So the first one, the southwestern corner of China, Tibet, populated by Tibetan Buddhists. I mentioned before, Buddhism kind of takes on characteristics of the regions as it's adopted. So you've got Taoism in Japan, you've got a Tibetan version of it, and so it makes sense that you'd be practicing Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet. This was a former independent country, and then in 1951, China re-annexed it to be part of China, much to the dismay and disagreement of the Tibetan people and the Tibetan leader. The logic behind it, I'll talk a little bit about this more later, is that this was once under the Chinese Empire, so therefore it should be returned to China. China is using that same logic. We mentioned this for the Kashmir region in India, that's why they've made a claim on that, because that used to be part of China. And also later in this lecture, I'll talk about the South China Sea and some of the claims in that area as well. The dry conditions make sense why it's sparsely populated. Buddhist temples found in Tibet. It's one of my places I'd like to go, but for reasons I'll explain later, I don't think I can. So the idea of a free Tibet, and the Dalai Lama was the child leader of Tibet when they were taken over by the Chinese, and he lives in exile now. And he writes books and has speeches about promoting peace and also promoting indicating the human rights abuses that are taking place in Tibet. Unfortunately, the Chinese will never let go of Tibet. It's asking them to cut off a hand in order for the Tibetans to be free. The Chinese just won't allow it. So the human rights abuses, the world can put pressure on China as to what's going on here. And we'll see those a little bit more coming to a head in the next region that we talk about as far as the world focus on some of the Chinese human rights abuses. In 2008, it flared in Tibet. The Chinese government decided that they would tell the Buddhists who their next leader would be, and that's kind of not how it works within their religion. And so the monks first protested, and then it kind of sprawled out into the general population as well. You got to figure that if you've pissed off Tibetan monks and Tibetan Buddhists to the extent that they're rioting in the streets, that was a very unhappy population. Now the Chinese government controls and knows where the tourists are and where the journalists are within the country. So as soon as this started to flare up, they evacuated everybody. 2008 was the year of the Olympics, and so China did not want the bad press coming out of this area, so they quickly got everybody who wasn't Tibetan or Chinese out of the area. Where the problems are now are in the Xinjiang region, in the northwest portion of China. The Uyghur people that live here are Turkic Muslims, and they've long been kind of waging a conflict, war, not really a war, that was an overstatement, my apologies, disagreements with the Chinese government. And the reason they're part of China, again, former Chinese Empire, and they're along the Silk Road. So trading with Central Asia and China proper would have gone through this region in through here. So we'll see what happens with that. It's kind of an ongoing issue with lots of denials out of the Chinese government. And the Chinese government does not take does not take well to criticism. All right. Hey, look, another area where they're going to get criticism. Hong Kong. So South China, this is their new growth area for industry in China. Hong Kong is the main city in the area, and it was a British colonial holding. They were leasing it from the Chinese government. It's complicated. And it was returned to China in 1995, but it was supposed to have special autonomy, separate rules that would apply to it that didn't apply to the rest of China. They were supposed to elect their own leaders, and that kind of slowly changed over time. And we'll see why that's led to a lot of rioting recently in Hong Kong as well. Well, Hong Kong's a great port. They've got great banking access to the rest of the world, trade connections to the rest of the world. And so once it was returned to China, China took advantage of that. And the Guangdong province, which is immediately inland from Hong Kong, that became a major production for goods to be shipped to the rest of the world. Hong Kong is incredibly populated, densely populated. Property values are just sky high in the area because of the demand in it. Gentrification is a huge issue in the city. So the unrest, just like in Xinjiang, began mid-last decade. But in here, this was in reference to, they were supposed to have their own democratic elections, but the Communist Party stepped in and said, no, we're going to decide who you can vote for, and commonly referred to as a controlled democracy. And the protest failed, and the candidate selected by the Chinese government was elected, but it kind of set the tone of you're not going to get the things that were promised to you when you were returned to China in 1995. It continued again, and so the violence was escalating from 2014 to 2016. Then 19, it really stepped up. There was a rule that if somebody had committed a crime, they could be extradited to China to be tried there. And the courts in China are notoriously corrupt. And so the people had wanted to stay in Hong Kong, and that continued over into this year. So the part that's in parentheses, just kind of an overview that the one country, two systems is slowly going away. And both sides have increased the violence. It isn't just the Chinese government, it's also the population who've increased the violence. What really escalated it this year was a national security law where you could be thrown in jail, sent to China proper, and taken out of Hong Kong. If you were a dissident, which is a very vague term, if you simply complain about the Chinese government or write bad things about the Chinese government, you could be arrested. And the way the law is written, some argue that it applies to anybody. And so when I mentioned before that I don't think I can go to China because I have made statements that what this was happening was unfair. And so I don't think I can go to China because I could be arrested. That's how strong these laws are. And so the only thing that slowed it down slightly was the coronavirus and the population trying to not congregate in large numbers, but this hasn't been settled. And again, this is something that the Chinese are facing a lot of international pressure on to back off of. The Canadian government and the British government have said that they would allow people who were born in Hong Kong prior to 1995 to migrate to Canada and to United Kingdom, which made the Chinese really, really angry. So this is an ongoing situation, much like is happening in Xinjiang, and much like when we get to the South China Sea, that China is trying to flex their power, and some of the other parts of the world are pushing back a little bit, and it's created this odd tension internationally. Not something that I'm worried about going to a world war over. It's just a tension. Liberty or death. The umbrellas are to help against the tear gas. And then that blue you're seeing sprayed there, that's their way of identifying protesters. So if they find somebody away from this area whose skin is dyed blue, they know they were at the protest and they could be arrested. That's my little Hong Kong flag. All right, let's get away from politics for a bit and go to Shanghai. Now, Shanghai was the industrial core for China for decades. And the reason for that was that the Shanghai was kind of the trade center that had gone back for centuries. So you'd have multiple countries that would have trade offices here, embassies here. And so most of their economic connections to China had gone through Shanghai. So the area around it grew as an industrial core. We'll see later that China recognized that that might be a problem. So they kind of diversified their industry into other areas as well. Tianjin to the north, and then obviously what I just mentioned, Hong Kong to the south. And so Shanghai, the Bund is the older area on one side, and then this is Pudong, the new city, what's referred to in it. I'll talk about the architecture in just a second, but just like in Hong Kong, the demand for land is so high that you're seeing buildings that are centuries old demolished just so they can put in some higher density housing in those areas. Pudong, it's kind of like Tomorrowland at Disneyland. Anytime you try and make something look futuristic, as soon as it's built, it looks dated and funky. And although I like the buildings, I think they're fun looking. This one's my favorite. It looks like a Saturn with its rings around it. Now, Shanghai is a very modern city with modern amenities, standards of living that are on par with anywhere in Europe or the United States. So my parents, kind of conservative, had this vision in their head that China was backwards, and boy, were they wrong. They went there on a cruise and were astonished at how modern China had become. And my dad came back and he was almost afraid of China, that, wow, they were as powerful and as modern as the United States. And a lot of people don't realize that there's really two sides to China. There's some of the rural areas where there's lots of, people are living as they did a century ago. And then there's areas that are living standards that are better than I have in Laguna Hills. And the best part, look, there's two McDonald's on the same street. In this area is also the Three Gorges Dam. This is the world's largest hydroelectric plant. And just like we saw for the Ataturk Dam complex, for the Aswan High Dam, these are for flood control and power. And this, for flood control, I've got to give it to the Chinese. This is important because the Yellow River would flood and kill literally tens of thousands of people at once. And so something had to be done about flood control. It's a controversial one, though, because of its environmental impacts. There's a freshwater swan, gee, Merry Christmas, a freshwater dolphin that's probably going to go extinct. The river isn't flowing sediments the way it used to be. And so anybody who's taking physical geography, you can recognize the really high sediment load in the stream. Well, when that stream enters the lake, all those sediments flow to the bottom. There's concerns that it may be full of sediments within 50 to 75 years. The Chinese government says, no, it's going to last 400 years. We'll just have to see what's going to happen. For location purposes, it's just generally just west of Shanghai. All right, we move to our final region of the 5 regions, the North China Plain. Here, the major city is Beijing. So you'll notice on the China bean, you had the T for Tibet, the X for Xinjiang, you had the HK for Hong Kong, the S for Shanghai, and then our final region, we have the B for Beijing. This is the fertile plains down the North China Plain. This is their main food production region. This is the reason that they've got the capital there. The capital was established centuries ago in this area. But in the 70s, there was concern by the Chinese government they'd concentrated too much industry in the Shanghai area. They didn't want more industry in the Beijing area because it was already a crowded area. So there was a small fishing city on the coast, Tianjin. And the government decided that this would become their new industrial center. And so the government built the factories, put in the roads, the rail network, and got the workers for all the factories. So Tianjin is now the third most populated city in China in a matter of a couple decades. Now, where they could get labor from, this relates to the farming practices. I keep mentioning some of the areas have very primitive farming practices. If the Chinese government introduced modern farming techniques to all of those areas, suddenly you'd have a lot of farmers out of their job because the food production would increase. You wouldn't need as many farmers. So what they'll do is they'll slowly introduce new farming techniques and equipment into some areas, which frees up workers that they can bring to Tianjin or in the Guangzhou region to the south. Pollution is horrible in the city, and it's partly dust coming off the Gobi Desert. It's industrial. It's the airflow patterns in the area. It's horrific. Some people didn't go to the Olympics in 2008 because out of fear for the smog. The Chinese government shut down industry 1 month ahead of the Olympics in order to help clear the pollution. They did what's referred to as cloud seeding, where they dropped silver nitrate in the clouds and helping to promote rainfall to help rinse some of the pollution. It worked until the very end of the Olympics, and the pollution started to creep back in. That's what it's supposed to look like. And if you've never seen farms, those are farms.